Hi, I'm Dr. Meredith Warner. Good morning. Um, we're going to continue our webinar series that we normally do for education and really just teaching. So what I've been wanting to do for a long time is talk about the history of the food industry and like, where did it start? Because I've wondered, how did we get where we are? So I've started to do some research, and as I learn, I'm going to put these talks together. So this is part one, and I'm going to share them with you. Now, just so you know, I'm also founder of the Well Theory, and that is a line of natural supplements and antioxidants and anti-inflammatories and things like that. And one of the reasons I started that company, or had to start it, is because of the lack of micronutrients in our current food supply. And it's almost impossible to achieve the goals of, for instance, the Mediterranean diet with what's available in grocery stores in our very busy lifestyles, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's why I have the Well Theory, which really helps literally supplement what you take in from the food supply. But, over the years, I've gotten very, very curious about why is it that 80% of the grocery store is ultra processed? How did we get here? Where did this start? And so here's part one of that story, sort of the beginnings of the whole concept of the food industry and what was going on in the country at the time. And then probably we can maybe take some votes or a little survey to see what part 2, 3, and 4 might be. I have some ideas of where I want to go with this, but maybe you guys could guide me. But today, this is just sort of like where this all began historically in the United States of America. So, okay. So why do I even care, or what has made me interested in the food industry? Well, 30% of Americans are overweight or obese, really 42%. So, and it's just inching up year after year, even with medications now that are remarkably effective, such as Ozempic and Mounjaro, and all of the drugs that are come behind them. Still today, almost a third or nearly half of us are overweight/obese, okay? And 10% are severely obese. I'm talking class 3, BMIs of 40 or 50. Sadly, 20 to 30% of children are obese in this country, and we're finding atherosclerotic plaquing in teenagers, and we're finding diabetes at younger and younger ages. So all of this is not boding well for the future of our country and like our economic viability and our ability to compete in the world if all of us are getting diabetes and atherosclerosis before we're like 20. And what we've learned over the years, and one of the reasons I got very much interested in natural medicine and natural health and started the Well Theory, is because I saw a lot of what I was seeing in orthopedic surgery was really fundamentally the same thing that was causing cancer, diabetes, skin diseases, autoimmune, all of these chronic, what are called non-communicable diseases. And the link to all of that is insulin resistance and obesity, and really a crappy food supply. Okay, and a lack of micronutrients. So all of this started to come together, and this is what got me interested, and this is why I care, and this is why this talk is happening. So insulin resistance, just to review, is when you have so much sugar in your blood all the time that the body just becomes inured to it or resistant to it, and the cells that typically capture the glucose and pull it into the cell and make it useful to you no longer do so in an efficient way, or they do it in a dysfunctional way if they even do it at all. And then you have all kinds of problems from excess glucose floating around. But this, in a nutshell, shows you over time what has happened to our country. And really, this is happening globally, honestly, with the exception of some developed or developing countries where the food supply has not been so westernized. Anywhere that's, I guess, second world or third or first world country, this is happening. But we're obviously the leaders in this. So the chart of the individuals there, that shows you on the far right is class 3 obesity, and on the far left is normal. Now, BMI, body mass index, is not really used anymore, or it's starting to come out of favor, but it's still basic information. It basically compares your height to your weight and gives you sort of a roundabout number of where you should be. So a normal BMI is somewhere between 18 and 25, and a BMI of class 3 obesity is 40 to 50. And I routinely see people in the 50s now. And, it's really hard to get them even cleared for surgery. So this chart on the left shows you the percent of the obese over time. So the far left on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, 1960s, there's really 5% or less are obese, okay? And this is children and adolescent. And then as time goes on, and this is really cutting off at 2017, so this is almost like a decade ago, so it's worse now. Just look, now we're up to almost a quarter of people, 1 out of 4, being overweight or obese. So what happened? I think that's what everybody's kind of struggling with. What is going on, and why are we so unhealthy? All right. Now, I'm very concerned because I'm a physician. I see people with arthritis and aches and pains all the time, and it just doesn't make any sense. And none of the surgeries we do really seem to solve the problem. We haven't really moved the needle on population health. We haven't moved the needle in like physical health. People are just getting bigger. They're getting weaker. They're getting stiffer. They're having more pain. The opioid epidemic, by the way, has never ended. It's probably worse now than it ever was. And as a veteran, I'm very concerned. So right now, 3/4 of Americans at the prime age you would think people would join the military, between 17 and 24, 3/4 would not qualify for one reason or the other. The number one reason being health issues, and the number two being physical weakness or lack of physical fitness, followed by education and criminality. Okay, but right now, so many people are overweight, they don't qualify, or worse, the military lowers its standards so that more people do qualify, which is what happens when we don't get enough recruits. Anytime you don't have enough recruits, you lower your standards. And I think that's happening now, and that's probably not a good thing for the future. So this all began at some point in the past, right? We've established that starting in the 50s or so, things just got really out of hand in terms of obesity and insulin resistance and chronic disease. So food in America has changed over time. Right now, we have massive abundance, okay? We have enough food every year to feed us twice over, even after exporting food, okay? Most people can afford more food or more calories than they actually need, thus the fact that 40% of us are obese or overweight, right? And then most Americans are rich relative to the rest of the world, even if we think we aren't. By far, Americans, even our worst off, are doing better than most people in the world. And so we have all this abundant food. We've got all these people. And what does that mean? That competition becomes very fierce for food companies. So the R&D, the research and development of food companies, is huge. They're always trying to innovate or come up with new products that'll attract our attention and get us to buy them over another competitors, right? And then so that makes marketing a huge thing. So today, the food industry is far different than it was when it began, which is what we're going to talk about. So right now in America, we've got companies, right, that have shareholders. And when you're a company and you have shareholders, people that have given you money to make a company, they expect a return. And so you're responsible to them. And that's called fiduciary duty. And that makes sense. But as a part of that, if you're a food company, you've got to convince the customers to eat more of your product or less of other products, right? Because you want to win the ultimate battle. So to increase sales, you've got to market, you've got to have PR or public relations. And then part of the PR thing is to establish that your products are healthy or healthier than others. And then this starts to be funding nutrition studies, lobbying efforts, lobbying to change guidelines and things like that in terms of federal food recommendations. But at the end of the day, companies are really just people. They're not these nebulous creations. It's a legal construct, but they're formed of people. I don't think that anybody's really got malicious intent. I think it's just sort of the system has blossomed into this. But these people that are in these food companies, they are not responsible for your health or my health at the end of the day. We are. So they're regulated. They're in a very, very regulated industry. But sometimes the regulations don't do what you want them to do, or they have laws of unintended consequences. And at the end of the day, the market wants what the market wants. So if a healthy food was what the market really wanted, you would probably see vegetable stores everywhere, right? You wouldn't see fast food stores because that would be what people wanted. But for whatever reason, humans want junk food, they want fast food, and they want food that's terrible. That is what sells. And that's why these companies are only selling those kind of foods. Only now are we starting to have a blossoming industry of healthier foods and wellness and things like that. And I think it's starting because of this groundswell of a knowledge base that hopefully I've been a part of and sharing with you, that is allowing people to understand how important food is. Food is medicine. You are what you eat is exactly what your mother told you. So until the market says, hey, we want a little corner shop that sells lettuce and kale everywhere, you're still going to see McDonald's, you're still going to see fast food, and you're still going to have grocery stores filled with ultra processed foods, which means you have to advocate for yourself. I have to advocate for you. And I'm just going to teach you what you need to know to be healthy, because none of this is going away. But right now we have an essentially corrupt food industry, and I'm going to get into that a little bit. And it's a problem, but it's so huge right now. I'm not sure that the tide's going to turn anytime soon. So all we can do is just increase our level of knowledge and know what we're buying and buy stuff that's good for us. But let's get back to the story of where this all began. Okay, so the food industry right now, they sponsor a lot of research. So a lot of what you read about the food and a lot of what you read about nutrition is industry sponsored, okay, by a variety of the meat industry, the dairy industry, the sugar industry, you name it. They all have I guess, a seat at the table. They all are funding different studies. Different societies fund different nutrition organizations. A lot of medical schools and public health schools are sponsored and funded by pharmaceuticals and or food industry companies. So just keep that in mind as you read studies, and just sort of pay attention to maybe what a potential bias could be. Not that it's always that way. Eventually, what happens in the food industry, there's no real revolving door with government, just like there's no true revolving door in the pharmaceutical industry. What it really is, I think, this is my opinion, is you go get a government job in the hopes that you will then get a really good industry job, which seems to be what happens. So you go work for the FDA for a while, and then you get to work for a pharmaceutical company. You go work for the SEC for a while, then you go work on Wall Street. You go, so on and so forth. So it's more like you get a job with the regulators so that you can then go on to industry and influence the regulators later, is what it looks like to me. And then, of course, Congress, everybody running for office has to get money from somewhere, right? And so a lot of that time, the funders of the campaigns are things like big ag, big food, big drugs, whatever. And that's just the way it is. I mean, that is a constituency, and you do need to be responsible to your constituencies, but I just need you to be aware of that. Nothing, to my knowledge, that the food industry does right now is illegal, and that is the point. It's totally legal. It's totally fine, and it's regulated. I put this up here to show you that this study in the recently, really, out of JAMA, Journal American Medical Association, in 2016, they showed that in the mid-1960s, there was a very hidden fact that the sugar industry was funding, and I want to say they were Harvard scientists, but that could be wrong. It was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, but there was a series of studies that showed that all of coronary heart disease, because this was at the time of Ansel Keys and the beginning of the Mediterranean diet and the 7-country studies. So in the 60s, they started this series of studies that showed that the real problem with coronary heart disease was fat, and that if you ate a low-fat diet, you would avoid heart disease. So really what they were trying to do is say that sugar has nothing to do with it, and sugar is fine. And they also knew in 1954 that if an American ate a low-fat diet, it automatically meant their sugar consumption would go up by at least 30%. So if you could convince people to avoid fat, they're by definition going to eat more carbs and sugar, and you're going to sell more. And it worked. It worked amazingly well, and it's still working. So in 1967, the New England Journal of Medicine said that no doubt reducing fat was all that mattered for heart disease, and left sugar out. And this was a great big battle between Ansel Keys and Youngkin, which we've talked about in other talks. But just know that not everything you read is true, or even if it's true at the time, it might get debunked later, which seems to be happening more and more often. There's been a lot of issues with scientific literature in terms of scandals, falsified data, manufactured data, repeated or copied data, things like that. So in the early 20th century, which is when all this began, okay, most death in the country at that time was from infection or disability, usually due to malnutrition, not overnutrition. So at that time, because people were so immunocompromised from malnutrition and they were getting sick, and we didn't have clean water supplies, and we didn't have the antibiotics and stuff we have now. So you can see all causes of death with the taller bar graph there versus a shorter one. What happened was we went from mostly like infectious diseases like tuberculosis, pneumonia, influenza, GI disorders, et cetera. And then it kind of got all compressed. And even though all of the death overall shrunk, because obviously we live longer now than we did, most of the death now is from cancer, heart disease, cardiovascular, cerebrovascular, like stroke kind of problems, versus infectious diseases. So in the earliest 20th century, when all this began, remember, most people were malnourished. Most people were dying of infection or some type of malnourished malady. And the regulations began in this environment. At this time, the government really wanted people to eat more of anything to try to stave off the infection problem. We have the opposite problem now, but the regulations haven't really caught up. So look at this graph. This is a Oh, my producer would like me to remind you to share and like and share the talks to people. All right, back to this. So this graph shows you in a great picture what we've died from over the years. So the purple is non-communicable diseases. That's things like cancer, diabetes, stroke, Alzheimer's, dementia, things like that, stuff you can't catch, right? The orange one is communicable, infectious, neonatal, all that kind of stuff. And then the green is accidents. So the communicable diseases are the things that you can catch. It's kind of stayed static if you look at the, I guess, the thickness of that stripe. But look at non-communicable diseases. I mean, in the 1900s, when the food industry began, it was like nothing, negligible. And now it's like over half of the deaths are from non-communicable diseases, which comes back to obesity and insulin resistance. It's pretty astounding if you think about it. And that happened very, very quickly, which is far faster than there can be any genetic shifts in a population. So this is not because of changes in the genes or evolution. Is that I think we have a question asking if pollution plays a role in it. I would say yes. But non-communicable diseases, most of them are coming down to mitochondrial dysfunction, inflammation, and oxidative stress and insulin resistance. Not so much damage to the lungs from air pollution or things like that. Okay, so food quality concerns and food regulation have sort of always been around. Regulations have kind of gotten out of control. And nobody thinks about the law of unintended consequences, but just know that this has always been a part of being a human. So even in the Bible, no meat can be consumed in the Bible unless it has been slaughtered. What does that mean? You basically weren't supposed to eat roadkill. It was in the Bible. Okay, so just remember that. And then in the Roman Empire had a very strict food supply system. They were very regulated. And in fact, when the Roman Empire fell, that's what allowed the plague to happen. The fall of the empire just allowed total chaos and whatever, and then disease spread. Adulterated olive oil was a concern even in the 1st century CE. So forever ago, people were adulterating or changing olive oil and selling fraudulent, contaminated olive oil. And guess what's still a problem today? Fraudulent and contaminated olive oil. So this has been going on forever. People are always trying to scam. You know that. You get all these emails all day, just like I do, and phone calls and texts trying to scam you. People have always been doing this. When they mess with the food supply, it's a little unsettling and upsetting, but hopefully we'll give you some knowledge to fight that. So I'm just going to paint the picture again of the early 19th century, before all these non-communicable diseases grew, before the obesity epidemic. This is back when we were having trouble keeping people nourished enough. Okay, everybody's dying of tuberculosis and whatnot. At that time, everybody cooked at home, almost exclusively. Rarely did you not eat at home. Now, 50% of meals are bought elsewhere or eaten out at a restaurant. Okay, that's a tremendous change. Foods used to be whole, local, and fresh. Now, 80% of your grocery store is processed, transported long distances. So back when the food industry started, they didn't have the refrigeration or the transportation systems or the storage systems to allow ultra-processed foods. 40% of people lived on farms in the 1900s, and most of those were subsistence, meaning, the farm existed really just to take care of the family, maybe a few people in the community. Now 2% of people live on farms. Now farms are so productive, again, we can feed Americans 2 times over even after we export all the food we export. So things have changed a lot. So just remember, back when this all started, most people were eating at home, most food couldn't be transported, and most food was whole. Most people lived on farms. So the number of farms in this country has dropped from 3.2 million to 1.9 million since 1960. So obviously there were far more even before then. However, the farm size has increased 40%. So what does this mean? Consolidation. So there's fewer subsistence farms, more of the land has gone into industrial agriculture. Now our farm productivity is 82% better than it ever was, and it's highly specialized and efficient. Now, sometimes that efficiency is detrimental, and I'm showing you a high intensity feedlot of cattle on the bottom here. Sometimes you don't want that hyper efficiency, but that's where we are now. So farm productivity has gone up tremendously. Farm size has gone up tremendously, but the total number of farms has diminished and the number of people living on farms has dropped. Okay, most people, as we said, died of infection in the 18th century and early 19th century and early 20th century. At the time when the food industry started, so this is like in the 1900s, roundabout, late 1800s, there was no refrigeration. So that's hard to conceptualize, but could you imagine no refrigeration and having to feed a family? I mean, what do you do? There was little transportation. There were no industrial farms. And at the same time, there's a Protestant health reform movement that started with this whole revivalist religious movement that was going on. And that's going to be relevant. You'll see how in a few. So this all begins with a man called John Harvey Kellogg. And you know the name Kellogg now. You know the name Kellogg, not just because of this guy, but really because of his brother who made it a huge company. But John Harvey Kellogg was the guy that started all of this, really. He was alive at this time when medicine and science are in a lot of flux. We're transitioning from an agrarian society to an industrial society. Medicine is just starting to become a thing. He actually finished training as a medical doctor at Bellevue in New York City in 1873. He published The Proper Diet of Man in 1873. So this guy was a doctor, very much interested in health, and felt that diet was a very important part of being healthy. So interesting, right? People knew this way back then, and we're just now figuring it out again. So what happened? He actually funded, so he had enough money at the time that he could fund the American Journal of Physical Anthropology. And he was made an assistant editor because he was funding it. Just like whenever you watch movies and you see producer, that just means they gave money. At the time, there was no government funding of research. Okay, so the only research that was being done was privately funded. And he was one of the guys. He was very much against smoking. You see this bottom thing where he wrote this, I guess, op-ed, "Tobacco is Poison." And this is a guy that invented cornflakes with his brother, okay? And that's what started the food industry. And we're going to get into that story now. Okay, so who was he? His brother's William Kellogg. So William Kellogg is actually the guy that took this company and made it the global phenomenon that you think of now when you think of Kellogg's. But John Harvey was a guy that really sort of fundamentally began the concept. He was the physician, and he was the guy that was very much interested in people's health. William Kellogg was just his little brother, and nobody in his family really thought he was going to become much at the time. John Harvey was smart, he was ambitious, and he was very religious. He was a Seventh-day Adventist. So this was part of that Protestant reform movement we talked about. And the Seventh-day Adventists were an offshoot of this whole revivalist movement. And they were very much interested in morality, decency, and health. And they felt that diet was an important part of, I guess, getting closer to God. It was a part of their religion. He helped to run what was called the Battle Creek Sanatorium. And there were a lot of sanatoriums at the time. So these are health resorts. So look around you now. What is the cool thing to do now? Go to a wellness retreat, right? Health resort, Canyon Ranch, whatever. Well, at the time, it was a Battle Creek Sanatorium, and there were a few others that were pretty popular. But John Harvey Kellogg made the Battle Creek Sanatorium famous, and it was a place where, you know, all of the important people would go to get their wellness and health. And part of his whole thing was the diet and what you ate. He really believed that the stomach was your focal point. That was his brand of healing. He really felt that digestion was the problem and the solution. So if he could fix digestion, because remember at this time, people were still having a lot of infectious diseases, a lot of digestive issues, a lot of diarrhea, cholera, things like that, a lot of dyspepsia. So he felt that if he could control what was going on in the gut, he could make people healthier. In fact, he said, quote, the great majority of diseases are primarily due to derangements of the digestive system, end quote. And this is another one of his books, Methods of Precision in the Investigation of Disorders of Digestion. So here we've got a Seventh-day Adventist in the early 1900s, very interested in the gut and interested in health. So this is a diagram from one of his books on the left, and I'm just saying he was very much ahead of his time, because now what is the cool thing on the block? Probiotics, gut health, the gut biome, the microbiome. Like all of a sudden we've discovered this new great thing. Well, Kellogg kind of knew it way back in the day. He just didn't have the technology and the know-how to get us where we needed to get. So that's how science works, incremental improvements, right? But he was way ahead of his time, thinking about the gut as the fundamental source of health back in the 1900s. One huge difference in how he thought about it versus how we think about the gut now. So here you have an image of a fecal transplant. John Harvey Kellogg probably would have had a seizure if you told him to do a fecal transplant on someone, because his way of thinking about gut health was totally different than ours. We're now very much pro having bacteria in the gut. He wanted the opposite. He thought the bacteria was the problem and needed to be gotten rid of. He thought that fiber and things like that made the gut work too hard and shouldn't be there. We have a different way of thinking about it, but at the fundamental, now we know the gut really is important. It's just he thought about it probably not in exactly the right way. And who knows if we're thinking about it in the right way now. So his goal was a sterile and abacterial, meaning no bacteria in the stomach. He wanted to eliminate the microbiome. He wanted to reduce all digestion issues and really take away the work of digestion from the human system. And he thought that would promote good health. He thought all foods should be very easily digestible because that would get rid of all of the digestive issues. And he therefore thought that most digestion of food should happen external to the body, meaning it should be pre-digested before you eat it. Now we try to feed the gut, we try to give it fiber. We want to have, you know, gassy foods because we want to feed the bacteria in the large intestine to create all of the neurotransmitters and short chain fatty acids that we need, et cetera, et cetera. But at the time, although he fundamentally was right that the gut mattered, he was thinking about it wrongly. And thus began the food industry. So just backing it up now, what was the food regulation at this time, okay? During the 18th century to the 20th century, there were very few food laws in general. They were just starting. At that time, you were allowed to use heavy metals to color food. You were allowed to preserve milk with formaldehyde. Coffee could be made from sawdust. Clay could be put into candy. Children were dying of arsenic and lead poisoning. There were a lot of problems. People were starting to become aware of it, and it started to become a thing where people were starting to pay attention to what they were eating. So right now, we still have a problem with food, right? And food coloring, et cetera. So this picture shows you wild-caught salmon and farm-raised salmon. Look at the difference in fat, 13 grams versus 27, the difference in calories, 281 versus 412. Look at the difference in color. So what do they do with farm-raised salmon now? They color it with dye. Right now, they use astaxanthin, which can be made from petroleum products, and in some fish farms it is. It can also be made from shrimp shell waste, because that's what colors the shrimp's shell. And then also it can be produced at an industrial scale by yeast or microalgae. So we're still coloring food to make it look more like it's supposed to look. It's just hopefully people aren't using things like lead and copper. But at the time of John Harvey Kellogg, really anything was a wild west of food production and regulation. Remember, there was very little food industry too at the time because there was no big ag at the time. So look at this cheese. This is Leicester cheese, I think is what it's called, but they were coloring it with lead oxide back in the day in John Harvey Kellogg's time to give it that reddish tint. These are the kind of things that were going on in the food industry as it started to grow, which then had to be regulated, and now we're into this hyper-regulation era. So in 1810 in Germany, this guy named Friedrich Accum, he wrote the actual first important work that discussed food quality and adulteration, because they were starting to notice this in Europe at the time too. The Lancet, which is still a journal today and a respected medical journal, in the 1850s did a series of studies looking at the food system in Europe, and they confirmed Friedrich Accum's findings. This was in 1850s. This is a series of studies. Remember, Kellogg graduated medical school in 1873. The US government at this time wasn't really concerned. They didn't really worry too much about food problems. And in fact, the United States, Patent and Trade Office was over food quality. Okay, so it was under the USPTO at the time. And then in 1848, they actually hired a chemist to start conducting food investigations because of all this work coming out of Europe. There was still no FDA. So this is all really sort of starting in Europe, looking at food quality, just like it is now, right? And then it's starting to come over here. And this is just when Kellogg's getting out of medical school and concerned about digestion and gut and stuff. So England was ahead of the game, believe it or not. So in the late 17th century, tea and coffee became a thing. Before that, everybody was drinking beer and ale all the time. So tea and coffee began to replace beer and ale as the main drink, but this was really more for the rich and the elite, okay? And so tea and coffee became quite expensive. And what happens anytime you have an expensive, desirable product that's in low quantity? Fraud happens. You look around you, name anything that comes to mind, and you know what I'm talking about. If it's expensive, if it's desirable, there's going to be fraud. So people were dyeing tea from China with Prussian blue, which was a dye at the time, to make it look greener. They were making tea from ash trees, steeping it in copper with sheep dung, drying it out to get it to look like tea, to make it greener. They were putting pigment to beech, elm, oak, or willow, whatever fraudulent product they could come up with, they were doing to sell in England. So England began to regulate the food industry. In 1718, there was the Adulteration of Coffee Act. In 1724, that act was strengthened a little bit, and then in 1730, they added other food products to it. In 1776, they made the Adulteration of Tea Act, okay? Obviously saying it's not legal to adulterate or change tea. In 1860, in the United Kingdom, they had the Adulteration of Food and Drugs Act, okay? Sort of like the beginning of true food regulation. 1984, the Food Act. 1990, the Food Safety Act, and that's still in use today in Europe. But 1776 was the Adulteration of Tea Act when they really started to clamp down on food quality, or tried to. This is not to be confused with the 1773 Tea Act, when the British East India Tea Company was established as a monopoly and they were the only ones allowed to sell tea in America. Okay, that's what spawned the Boston Tea Party, and it had to do with taxes. Taxes on tea had been around since 1767, but the 1773 Tea Act made a monopoly, which of course made tea even more expensive. So therefore the Boston Tea Party. So if you notice, everything is the same, nothing changes, nobody wants to pay taxes, people are still trying to run scams and fraud, and you got to watch out what you eat. In 1810, this is when Friedrich Accum wrote his treatise in Germany, right? 50% of the food supply was adulterated in Europe and here. And that's when he wrote that document. And then in 1875, and it took, look at how long that was, 65 years. I mean, that's a long time. The Food and Drug Acts in England starts. So that whole time span, 1810 to like 1900s, it's just kind of a mess. And this is when Kellogg came to being. Unless you think all is well today, this is recently found, the FDA confirms presence of lead chromate in cinnamon applesauce pouches. So there's still food fraud going on today. Like I said, olive oil. Remember the melamine in the formula in China a few years back? There's always something. You always got to be mindful and be aware. But it was really bad in the 1900s. So in 1934, the History of Food Adulteration was written, a book actually by Frederick Philby. And if in 1906, probably a lot of you watching this right now know what I'm talking about, The Jungle by Upton Sinclair was written. So Upton Sinclair was actually a socialist, and he spent time undercover in meat packing plants in Chicago. And the whole goal of him, he wasn't talking really about the food supply and health and wellness. He was more concerned about the labor movement. So he did this series of articles for a socialist magazine at the time called Appeal to Reason. And he was trying to promote socialism and better labor practices and whatnot. Well, when The Jungle was published, what the public really cared about was the quality of the meat, because they were at the first time able to see inside of the food industry at the time and realize how terrible it really was. This is when the so-called beef trust, primarily in Chicago, was exposed. So this is the common practices of the time of how food was prepared and how it was processed and then how it was put out to the public. And he was one of the first ones in America to really make it common knowledge. So The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, seminal piece of American history. At this time in 1898, we were at war, the Spanish-American War. And there was a general, General Nelson Miles. He was the commander of the U.S. Army. He complained to the government that the Armour Meat Company, the Armour Meat Packaging Company, and other meat packers were sending chemically treated meat to his soldiers. He noticed that his soldiers were not doing so well with the meat products they were getting from the food industry in the United States during a time of war. In 1906, Teddy Roosevelt signed the Meat Inspection Act. This was the first time the government went in and really checked out how food was being made and what's going on in the food industry. At this time, then the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, was allowed to inspect factories. And that's only because Teddy Roosevelt was part of this whole Spanish-American War experience. So this just shows you corned beef, and this is kind of what they were feeding the soldiers, and they were throwing things like potassium nitrate to make it pretty and pink and all this. There's just craziness going on, and it's even worse than this. They were actually putting rotten canned beef into cans and then put boric acid to hide the stench of the meat. And that's what they were feeding the soldiers in the Spanish-American War. Surprisingly, a lot of them became unfit. Some of them died. Roosevelt was a colonel in Cuba, and he said that he would have eaten his old hat before he ate embalmed meat from these companies, from the beef trust. So all of this is in the early 1900s, just as Kellogg's coming out of medical school. The Armour meat scandal. So the common practice, and this is from a statement from a superintendent at Armour and Company, so this is in the public domain, was to pack and sell carry-on. Remember I told you the Bible said you can only eat meat that's slaughtered, not roadkill? So they're even breaking that rule and basically finding roadkill, packing it up, putting boric acid and formaldehyde and selling it to soldiers. So Congress convened a committee, and then they declared unwholesome, therefore illegal, formaldehyde, boric acid, salicylic acid, and all the other additives these guys are doing to make the beef palatable or hyper palatable. There's even more to this story. In the 1880s, Harvey Wiley, and if you ever want to read about somebody really cool in American history, this is the guy or one of them. He was the chief of the Bureau of Chemistry at the USDA, appointed by President Lincoln as the head of the chemistry section in 1883. And he created what was called the Poison Squad. And I'll talk about that in a minute. In 1931, this eventually was renamed as the FDA. So he was sort of the first one to really start testing the food supply, okay? Meanwhile, in 1910, Rockefeller's funding a review of medical schools. And then 1916, Rockefeller funds Johns Hopkins. So this is when Rockefeller started to take over the whole medical school establishment and kind of guide where that went, which is where we are today. And that could be another topic if you guys are interested in how medicine really started in this country and how medical school started. That's another very fascinating topic. But all of this is happening kind of all at once while Kellogg's coming up, to become who he is at the Battle Creek Sanatorium. Okay, so Teddy Roosevelt is integral to all of this food regulation stuff. So he started in 1906, we get the Meat Inspection Act, and then we get the Pure Food and Drug Act. And the important parts of the Pure Food and Drug Act is the food safe to be eaten? And was it mislabeled? So this is when the whole labeling thing comes in. And now all food regulation is your label legal? Are you allowed to put that on your label? Are you allowed to make this claim or that claim or whatever? And at the time, they said there was no interstate commerce of adulterated or mislabeled foodstuffs allowed. That's how the federal government could get in and regulate over the states, right? Because remember, we're a federalist republic. So each state is its own entity, but the federal government has ways of controlling certain things and supersede state law. And one way they do it is interstate commerce. And so the Food and Drug Act took advantage of that. And then there was a Certified Colors Act in 1907, and 7 safe coloring agents were named, lead not being one of them. And 4 are still in use today. So 1914, there was an important legal case, U.S. versus Lexington Mills, and that case said that it's the government's responsibility to prove that nitrites added to flour is not safe. So at that time, the law of the land was that the mere presence of an additive in a food product does not mean the food is unsafe. Well, since then, that's been a bit reversed, and now it is more that you have to prove that an additive is safe before you can put it into a food product, in theory. So again, 1933, the 1906 Food and Drug Act was revised. Okay, remember 1906 was Teddy Roosevelt's time, 1933 it's revised. 1938, we now have the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. In 1949, the first guidance document is written, and I don't know if you're aware of this, but guidance documents aren't really law. They're just opinions or guidance documents, but they're sort of, or they used to be when we would defer to state regulatory agencies. It used to be considered almost as good as law, but that's not so much the case anymore. And then in 1958, there was a Food Additives Amendment, and the concept of GRAS happened. So GRAS, which is generally recognized as safe. So if something's been in the food supply for forever or for years and years and years, and then it's turned into an additive, it's generally recognized as safe. Okay, so for instance, I guess sugar would be the simplest thing. It's in the food supply. It's in foods that we eat naturally. So if you add it to something else, it's generally recognized as safe. Okay, so coloring, sweeteners, flavor enhancers, thickeners, emulsifiers, preservatives, all of this has gotten very much out of hand in the food industry, but it was just being allowed at this time, or being regulated, I should say. Because of course they were adding formaldehyde and lead and copper to food at the time. Yeah, this was well before the high fructose corn syrup debacle, which is another topic we could talk about in another talk. Okay, by 1997, the FDA was overwhelmed with the work of stating if something was GRAS or not. So at that time, companies would make an application for whatever, and the FDA would have to say, yes, this is GRAS or not. So apparently it was too much work for them to do. So they turned all the responsibility back to the food industry. And that was the federal, or the Food and Drug Administration Modernization Act of 1997. So now the food industry determines if something is GRAS or not, and then the FDA may or may not come in later if there's any big problems. So GRAS determinations happen without the FDA being notified. So a food company could just say, yeah, this is GRAS, generally recognized as safe. They don't even have to tell the FDA now, and they don't have to tell the public. They can just say, yep, high fructose corn syrup, good to go. We're going to add it to everything. And that was fine at the time, and it's legal. Okay, remember, the FDA really sort of was coming to being as it didn't even exist really as Kellogg came on the game. And Dr. Harvey Wiley and the Poison Squad, and this is the Poison Squad here. So what that was a group of young men that he recruited, and basically they would sit and eat and test different food products and see if it made them sick. That was their primary method of testing the food supply, which is pretty crazy if you think about it. But that's how it all started, the FDA, that is. Okay. Okay, so remember, John Harvey Kellogg was born as a Seventh-day Adventist. He's living in Battle Creek, Michigan, which is one of the main headquarters of that particular Protestant revival movement. And he worked very closely with one of the founders of the church, James White, and his wife. And then he published a document called the Health Reformer every month. And it advocated for vegetarianism, which is a big piece of Seventh-day Adventists, natural remedies, temperance, health, hygiene. So these are all great concepts if you think about it. And it was part of his religion, part of his life, part of his daily being. And he ran a sanatorium or a health resort, advocating for all of these things. And today, if you think about it, the Seventh-day Adventists are still around and still quite healthy. And in fact, Loma Linda, California is one of the so-called blue zones because it's a community of Seventh-day Adventists. So this shows their diet, primarily vegetables, fruits, legumes, and soy. Very, very little meat, if any, very little added sugar. So they just basically live a very healthy, temperate lifestyle, no alcohol, obviously no illicit drugs or anything like that. And they tend to live longer than the rest of us. So there's something to what Kellogg was doing. I just think that he didn't quite get it, but that's not his fault because the science wasn't there. So again, around 1875, 1873, he graduates medical school. He becomes the superintendent of the Western Health Reform Institute, which then converted to the Battle Creek Sanatorium or the health resort. But in medical school, when he was in New York, he realized that there was really a need for ready-to-eat cereals that were easily digestible that would help promote his concept of a healthy gut. Remember, at the time, everybody's eating fried meats and bacon in the morning if they're not eating gruel. And if they're eating gruel, it took forever to make that. And if you're a single male in New York City going to medical school and living in, whatever closet you're living in, it's probably really hard for you to make your own breakfast. This is when he came up with the idea of a breakfast cereal, a ready-to-eat breakfast cereal. It was when he was in medical school in New York. Breakfast in the late 1800s and early 1900s was really just an excessive amount of work for the women of the world, we'll say. There were no refrigerators. Fresh fruit and vegetables are exceedingly rare if you didn't grow it yourself and if they weren't in season. Meat was salted to preserve it because there were no refrigerators, okay? So if you're a housewife, you would have to wake up early. You'd have to start the wood fire stove. Then you'd have to make oatmeal, which took like an hour or two, oatmeal or gruel. Go get your fried meat out. Go find the eggs under the chicken out in the back subsistence farm where you lived. And then you would fry some eggs, fry some meat, and then maybe have this gruel that you spent an hour to make. It's very long, very laborious, and very heavy, and obviously not like the greatest way to start a day, with the exception of, special occasions nowadays. But this was the standard breakfast at the time Kellogg's in medical school. And remember, the 1850s, the Lancet ran this series of articles on the food industry. 1883, Dr. Wiley's appointed by Dr. Lincoln and the Poison Squad starts. 1876 was the end of the Reconstruction era in our country. In 1879, the Standard Oil Trust formed Rockefeller Medical Schools. In 1883, interestingly, this is when our 4 time zones were created. They were created by the railroad companies to make their lives easier. And so that transportation is just starting. In 1886, there were the Haymarket riots in Chicago. And guess what those were about? There were a lot of strikes at the time. Remember, history repeats itself. This riot was protesting the killer of workers by the police at the McCormick Reaper Works. And that labor movement at the time included a lot of socialists, communists, anarchists. Remember, Upton Sinclair wrote for a socialist magazine. So all of this is going on at the time. And then in 1898, we have this war with Spain. Soldiers are getting fed carrion treated with formaldehyde and boric acid. Hawaii's getting annexed and, made into a state. So it's just a crazy time in American history. There's just a lot of change happening when Kellogg graduates medical school and realizes, hey, I need a ready-to-eat breakfast cereal. So when he was younger, the Seventh-day Adventist, in the 1830s and 40s, there was this guy, William Miller. He was a Baptist preacher. He predicted that Jesus would return on October 22nd, 1844. And he had followers. They were all Millerites, is what they were called. Well, when Jesus didn't return on October 22nd, 1844, a lot of the Millerites left his movement and they started their own. And these are the revivalists, or the Second Great Awakening in America. This is where you get dispensationalism, the Adventists, the Latter-day Saints. All of these religious offshoots started at this time. And John Harvey Kellogg was part of that movement. He was a Seventh-day Adventist. And they emphasized personal responsibility, moral improvement, taking care of your body. The body is a temple, all that kind of stuff. They were an offshoot of the Millerites, founded by Ellen White, the wife of James White. Remember, I told you he worked closely with them, and she was actually considered a prophet at the time. So the Seventh-day Adventists were again ahead of their time, not only promoting health and wellness and just taking personal responsibility for your health, but also their main leader was a female, highly unusual at the time. Their headquarters were Battle Creek, Michigan. And today, they are the second largest religious healthcare network in the world. Think about that. It's pretty amazing. And this is where the food industry started, with one of these guys way back in the day. And medicine and health have always been a part of their mission. Medicine and health for all, I should say. So again, we're at war with Spain. And at this time, John and his brothers sort of accidentally create cornflakes, which was the first ready-to-eat breakfast cereal. So they were flaking wheat berries to try to make granola when they sort of found this concept of flakes, right? Granola came from granula, which was from this guy, Dr. Jackson, Dr. James Jackson in 1863. That was really the first ready-to-eat breakfast cereal. Then John Harvey made a competing product that he wanted to sell at his sanatorium because Jackson was selling it at his sanatorium. So Kellogg, having a competing health resort, wanted to have a food product there. And of course, he's believing that illness starts in the gut. He's obsessed with intestinal activities. He has a health resort. He sees this guy making granola, so he makes granola. And this is where it all started. 1906 was the first commercial production of cornflakes, and we'll get to how that goes. But all of this is starting really because of competition. In 1829, Dr. Sylvester Graham comes out with graham crackers. Guess what he is? A clergyman and a health reformer. So all of these guys that started the food industry, a lot of them had a religious part to them. And then part of that religion was promoting good health and good body health. And so a part of that was these simple, easily digestible foods that weren't too rich, that weren't too flavorful, that weren't spicy, and that were meant to, in this case, the graham crackers are meant to supplement the graham diet. And then the National Biscuit Company, Nabisco, bought them from Sylvester Graham and commercialized them. Graham and Kellogg and all of these preachers / religious people that became food product guys, they really believed that rich foods made people lusty and kind of got in the way of moral decency and treating your body properly, okay? So a lot of these foods are very simple, very plain, very easily digestible, and it's because of this whole second revivalist kind of movement at the time, which is crazy if you think about it. So in summary, breakfast in the 19th century, very heavy, very laborious. No refrigeration, women waking up early, making gruel on a wood fire stove, et cetera, et cetera. Food regulation was in its infancy, just starting. Adulteration and fraud in the food supply, very, very common. The Protestant reform movement is starting with the Quakers, the Seventh-day Adventists, the Latter-day Saints, what have you. There's the Spanish-American War. There's the Beef Trust. Kellogg is becoming a physician. He's heading up his family health resort. He believes in morality, and he believes that everything begins in the gut, and food should be very easily digestible and really not rich or tasty. And then, so look at the 1850s on the left side of the x-axis on this chart, and then the y-axis is the amount of sugar, dairy, high fructose corn syrup, and obesity in our country, okay? So 1850, all this is starting. Sugar consumption's going up. And then late in the 60s, high fructose corn syrup. And then in the 50s, 60s, and really not till the 80s and 90s, does obesity skyrocket. So this is just the beginning of the food industry. It really obviously didn't start to affect our health till after 1960, 1970. And that's going to be later topics. But this is just sort of, I'm trying to paint the picture of where the food industry really began and why in this country. So a timeline of cereal. So to me, breakfast cereal is really the beginning. It is exemplary of the food industry in this country. So 1829, we have graham crackers, Dr. Sylvester Graham. 1863, we have granula from Dr. Jackson at the Jackson Sanatorium in New York. 1876, Dr. Kellogg makes a granula at the Battle Creek Sanatorium. In 1881, he loses a patent lawsuit with Dr. Jackson, so he names it granola, thus granola. That's why we have granola now, because in 1881, he lost a patent lawsuit for granula. In 1896, they patent flaked cereal, Granose Flakes. In 1897, grape nuts are created. Now, grape nuts were created by C.W. Post. You know Post makes cereal, right? That's one of Kellogg's main competitors. Well, C.W. Post was a patient at the Battle Creek Sanatorium, loved all of the foods that Kellogg was making, and wanted to make his own. So just crazy how all of this started together in sort of this little tribe, if you will, in Battle Creek. 1905, we get puffed rice from the Quaker Oats Company. And that was food shot from guns. That was on all their packages. It was their marketing shtick. And then in 1906, the brother, William Kellogg, gets the rights to cornflakes and starts massive production. The interesting thing about this was William Kellogg wanted to make it more marketable. So he wanted to add sugar and do a couple other things to make it more hyper palatable, make it more tasty so that more people would buy it. John didn't want to do that because he was very much about the Seventh-day Adventists, like no added sugars. We want to keep this super duper healthy. I only want to sell it at the Battle Creek Sanatorium. They had a big family fight that went on forever. But eventually William Kellogg won, and thus we have the breakfast cereal industry that we have today. So in 1909, cornflakes, and that was the first breakfast cereal. And I'm going to explain how it's kind of made and everything in a little bit. But in 1909, remember this is under the control of William Kellogg now, the first cereal box prize for kids. So this is when it began to be marketed to kids, 1909. 1934, Post, remember C.W. Post, Toasties, pays Walt Disney $1.5 million for the rights to use the characters for a year on the cereals. So now we start to use cartoon characters to sell breakfast cereals to kids. 1941, they come up with Snap, Crackle, and Pop, the characters for Rice Krispies. Not until 1960 did the FTC decide that perhaps they might want to look at marketing to kids for these highly sugared cereals and highly processed breakfast cereals. But from when J.H. Kellogg came up with it to 1960, it was the wild, wild west. So now we have an industry. The food industry has started, and it started in Battle Creek, Michigan, which is still to this day known as Cereal City. Railroads started. They gave national distribution, okay? It's a city on 2 rivers, so they have that way to distribute too. It started as grain, flour, and sawmill centers. So what happened was, in order to increase production, they started to invent machines. They started to make more efficient farms. They started to concentrate different farming activities. And the whole concept of big ag sort of began here to really make breakfast cereal to sell to the public, because John Kellogg thought we needed an easily digestible cereal when he was in medical school. Many reformers lived in this area, even Sojourner Truth did at the time. But the entire cereal industry, they call it the Silicon Valley of cereals. So if you notice, Silicon Valley, everybody that wants to start a computer company goes there because all of the people that work in that industry are there, the infrastructure's there. Same thing with the cereal industry. Everything started there. They invented the machines. They built the machines there. They built the farm equipment there. They developed the farming techniques, so on and so forth. By 1911, there were 100 different brands of cornflakes all in that Battle Creek area. Now, obviously, not all of them made it, but that just shows you how this just blew up. So, of course, we've got the law of unintended consequences. So remember, breakfast cereals started as a healthy alternative to what was then the common first meal of the day, or the break of the fast, the breakfast. All brands were started by physicians who believed in health and wellness in the beginning. And they were meant to improve digestion. So they were meant to be easily digestible and easy to pass through, and to help with bowel movements and things like that. They dramatically helped housewives in terms of convenience and labor, But they did spawn the era of ultra-processed foods under which we now suffer. So breakfast cereals today, even though they started as an invention by physicians to make you healthier, are probably one of the least healthy foods you can eat. We know that now. But in their defense, John Kellogg lived to 91 at a time when the average life expectancy was 64 to 67. William Kellogg lived to 91. Dr. Jackson lived to 84, and only Post died at 59, but he killed himself for other reasons. So all these guys lived a very long time at a time when the life expectancy was far lower than it is now. So they were onto something with this, but I think the rest of their lifestyle also probably played into it as well. So often they would recommend that you eat the cornflakes with a bit of milk. Sadly, the milk recipe in the late 19th century was not that great. Again, remember the food regulation wasn't so great. So milk in the late 19th century was sometimes pond water that they would dilute, or they would dilute milk with pond water to save money. Okay, so that made it a little bit gray, a little bit gross. So what do? They added plaster dust to thicken it, make it a little bit whiter, a little bit of yellow lead that gave it that yellow hue like it was creamy, remove the gray color from the pond water. And then they would take the skim cream off because they could sell that for a higher profit. And they would add pureed calf brain to give it that frothy creaminess. And then they would add formaldehyde because, hey, that increased shelf life. And then they'd put it on the cornflakes that Kellogg invented to make you healthier. So obviously it didn't work so well. But you get my point. All of this was just crazy. So cornflakes are started to make you healthy, but this terrible milk that was not regulated, which was called swill, by the way, that's where the term swill comes from, was added to these cornflakes for breakfast cereal, ostensibly to make us all healthier. And that was what was going on in the early 19th century. So you may be wondering to yourself, because I was, well, how are cornflakes made? Well, basically you take sweet corn or maize, it gets dried on the stalk, it gets harvested, and then it gets milled. Well, what does milling mean? When you mill something, you remove the hull, you remove the outer layers, and that leaves only the center of the grain, which is the endosperm. What does that do? Makes it very easy to digest, which was Kellogg's goal. But what he didn't know was you remove all of the fiber and almost all of the nutrients, okay? Now, alternatively, you can have grits, which is stone ground corn, or hominy. Hominy is when an alkali or a base solvent is added to peel off the outer hull instead of milling it. This is called degerming or nixtamalization. Now, interestingly, this is a thousands-year-old processing technique to make cereals out of very fiber-rich products like corn. But nixtamalization, or this hominy technique where you add this alkali solvent, actually frees up the niacin and the minerals and actually makes the product a bit healthier. And that was the traditional way to do things. So what do we do in America? We sort of back that out and we go to the high-intensity industrialized way to do things. But some of these processing techniques that have been done for thousands of years were actually not terrible. So after you nixtamalize it and grind it, the grits are cooked in high heat and high pressure. Now, one thing we've learned since then is that high heat, high pressure create what are called advanced glycation end products. And this is when they mostly form during the ultra processing of food. And what are those? It's when there's a non-enzymatic combination of a sugar to an amino acid to create sort of a monster protein that really just gums up the works in the human body. The micronutrients are also further destroyed in the high heat, which was typically around 100 degrees Celsius, which is really, really hot. And then sugar, salt, malt are added. These are all different ways to sweeten it and make it taste better, make it more palatable. It could be sorghum malt, it could be barley malt, but typically 4 grams of sugar added per serving. Now, the total limit of sugar per day per the government now, which may or may not be correct, is 25 grams per day for women. If you're adding 4 grams per serving in these breakfast cereals, you can imagine this adds up over time. And obviously, we're eating too much sugar. But it began back then. Flavoring and preservatives are added after you do all of this. Why? Because it still doesn't taste quite right. So you got to add a little bit of vanilla, maybe some caramel, whatever, make it taste good. And then you've got to preserve it for shelf life. So you got to put preservatives in it so it can travel across the country and sit on a shelf somewhere until somebody gets to buying it. And then guess what we do? because you took out all of the micronutrients and all of the good stuff and the minerals during the processing part, you add it back at the end, and that's called fortified. That's why all the breakfast cereals say fortified with 9 essential vitamins and minerals, because it was destroyed during the processing, so they add it back because they have to.
But adding it back, like, why doesn't it add value?
No, adding it back adds value, but there's still nothing better than the whole natural food the way it first came. They added it back because I think after a while they realized that baby development in the womb wasn't going so well without certain vitamins. So the good and bad of processing. So it removes nutrients, but nixtamalization does allow niacin, which is an essential B vitamin, to stay in the grain. The high heat and chemicals do kill bacteria, which makes the food safer to eat, obviously. Sterilizes the food, but it also removes most nutrition. So if you're going to be making mass-produced industrial scale foods that you're going to sell and you're going to be subject to lawsuits, obviously you have to kill all the bacteria, right? So a lot of what these food industry people do, they're doing because they're regulated. They have to kill bacteria. It has to live on the shelf. You can't have this on the shelf without this much sugar because bacteria can grow, whatever. There's a gazillion rules, right? But at the end of the day, it ultimately destroys the actual food itself and makes it more of a food stuff, which is, we went from cornflakes to food stuffs that we live under now.
Like increasing the shelf life.
So remember, not all food processing is bad. So corn and pellagra, you may or may not have heard of pellagra. This is a deficiency disease, okay? Pellagra killed 100,000 people in the early 20th century, and this was a niacin deficiency. So lack of niacin from the heavy industrial processing of flour, which we just discussed, the milling and everything, wasn't even discovered until 1937. That's when fortification had to start. So basically, we were causing pellagra with the food industry until somebody figured it out. And then because of that, by law now, you've got to come back and add the niacin. Nixtamalization is a 3,000-year-old way of making tamales, believe it or not, is where it started, using corn, which preserves the niacin because it changes the chemical structure of the corn itself in the process of getting those hulls off with that alkali solvent. So turns out the newer method of processing was much more dangerous to people than the old-fashioned way, but obviously that took a little bit longer under the current technology of the time in the early 20th century. So what is pellagra? Dermatitis, dementia, diarrhea, and death. It's a deficiency of B3 and tryptophan, okay? And it's the basis, we think, of where Dracula started in the literature, because these people would go out in the sun and their skin would just get destroyed. And remember, the myth of Dracula is that if he sees the sun, everything just gets destroyed, therefore must sleep in a coffin and all of that. We think that's related to pellagra, which was pretty common in the early 20th century. It is totally preventable. Here's somebody nixtamalizing corn and making tamales at home. So if you do it this way, you can preserve the niacin. If you do it the way we do it in America with industrialization, you have to fortify it with niacin. Okay, so grit processing from dehulled corn. So it starts with 33% moisture. It's agitated or shaken around. It's dried in a drying machine to drop the moisture. Then it's put into tempering tanks, which distributes the moisture evenly. Then it's put into a flaking machine. So now we've gone from the grits into a flaking machine, and they're roasted again, and more advanced glycation end products are formed. So the crust on bread, the sear on a steak, the caramelization of sugar, all of that is the browning product or the Maillard reaction, which is advanced glycation end products being formed. So we've roasted and blistered and browned the corn, and now we've got flakes. And guess what flakes are? Externally digested food, which is what Kellogg wanted. And one of the main things that he invented to start the food industry was the steel rollers. So the steel rollers would roll out this whatever substance from the grits and make this flat dough that they could then roast and blister and then cut up into flakes. Interestingly, also at the time, he started the whole concept of a sewerage system because John Kellogg was so interested in digestion. He wasn't just worried about getting the food in and making it easily digestible, but he wanted people to poop a certain number of times a day, and he wanted it to be a certain type of a bowel movement. He was obsessed with it, would look at him to, do whatever, keep samples and examine his patients' bowel movements. But because his patients at the Battle Creek Sanatorium had to evacuate themselves so often because of what he was feeding them and doing with them with enemas and whatnot, he actually helped the city of Battle Creek create the first town sewer system, or one of the first ones in the country. So really, food industry spawned the sewage system industry, the big ag, big industrial processing of food. And it all started because a few of these preacher turned entrepreneurs wanted to make a healthier food for us, which is pretty fascinating, I think. So again, external digestion was key for Dr. Kellogg. Quote, one's own food acquisition and cooking techniques could never eclipse the health benefits of foods that were manufactured under the banner of nutritional and digestive science. Follow the science, Dr. Harvey said. So he really believed that the manufacturing and processing of food with his methods was better for you than whole, natural, high-fiber foods that were difficult to digest. We know the complete opposite is true now, but this is where it all started. Good intentions gone bad. He wanted the flakes to convert natural starches to sugar before they got into your system, which is the exact opposite of what you should want. You want the big complex carbs and not the simple carbs, right? We want the fiber and the cellulose. We don't want the added sugar. But for him, the dextrin was easier to digest. The highly refined flours, the highly refined corn endosperm, easier to digest. So therefore, there were no digestive problems. Everybody was pooping as much as he wanted, and he felt like everybody was healthier that way. Turns out it's kind of destroyed the country, but that's for another variety of reasons. So he made foods ready for prompt assimilation, which is where we live now. Go to the grocery store, 90% of the food there can be promptly assimilated. Rollers did the work of the stomach and intestine, okay? Started the digestion process. It was the first consciously applied prosthetic for digestion. That was his concept. If we can get machines to digest the food for you, you'll be healthier, is what he thought. Science could make better foods than nature can. Turns out that is not true. He believed that human digestion could not handle the foods that were put on this planet naturally, that they needed to be processed before you ate them. Sewage, before the cornflakes were invented and before the Battle Creek Sanatorium, was effectively cement vaults, privies, bedpans, and outhouses. Because he wanted people to eat cornflakes 3 times a day and therefore evacuate their bowels 3 times a day, he actually lobbied the town council to put in a full sewage system. And oh, by the way, he was giving people 15-quart enemas at the time too at the Battle Creek Sanatorium. So he just needed something more than an outhouse, and he got it because he had that much power. But that's just an interesting aside.
He's the reason for plumbing too.
Basically. So subsistence farms could not produce enough of this product for him to sell and for his brother to sell. So they needed industrial specialized farms to create massive amounts of corn to be able to produce the cornflakes they wanted. And that's what we have today. Remember, I told you our farms are 82% more productive, 40% larger, and only 2% of the population live on farm, whereas 90% of us did before. All of this is because of Cereal City, really. That's where it started.
Did you say this city?
Battle Creek, Michigan is Cereal City. So now what? So we've got the history of breakfast cereal. They started with good intentions. Convenience was great. It really did free up a lot of time for housewives. So that was great. Nutrition was the goal. Sadly, nutrition has been destroyed. Go walk down the cereal aisle today and start to look at the ingredients, and you'll realize what I mean. But they are fortified with 9 essential vitamins and minerals, so they must be healthy, right?
Even the healthy ones don't seem healthy.
Okay. So remember I told you there were like 100 brands of cornflakes. Most of them died off. Well, now, of course, there's a gazillion brands of cereals, at least 350 by the 2010s, starting with like 0 in the 1860s. So 1900s is cornflakes, okay? And then it just blossomed after that and just became a huge thing because it was more convenient. It was easier, and we're led to believe that it was healthy. And then, of course, the marketing to children began at this time as well.
What contributes to the rise in the number of new brands?
What contributes to the rise of the number of new brands? The market demanded it. You only make a product if people are going to buy it and you're going to make a profit from it. Obviously, the market wanted breakfast cereals. But I think that, hopefully over time, we'll see that kind of go back down, because now we're starting to realize how unhealthy processed foods really are for us. Next. That's the last one. Oh. So now the food industry is a bit not great, right? I think John Kellogg and William Kellogg, they had reasonably good intentions, as did Jackson and Graham. But now we use very cheap ingredients. We've got genetically modified corn. We've got genetically modified wheat. It's all Roundup ready. We've got added sugar. We've had high fructose corn syrup, which of course has now been disallowed, but we have about 80 different other names of sugar. So it's really hard. Maltose, dextrin, brown sugar syrup, corn syrup, whatever. There's a gazillion ways to add sugar and not call it sugar. And that's still going on. We've got very legal, very cheap food additives, colors, emulsifiers, preservatives. We're adding back fortification, of course. And they're all processed. They're essentially chemical products that are easily digestible by you. But they're fake foods, and it's a problem. Look at the sugar as a percent of total weight of the original Cheerios. 5.1% original Cheerios was sugar by weight. Lucky Charms, 37%. Fruit Loops, 30.8%. So a full third of the weight is sugar of these cereals, which is astounding. Frosted Flakes, which is part of the National School Breakfast Program, 35% of the weight is sugar. Think about it. This is what has happened to an industry begun by doctors trying to make people healthier. It's just been completely warped, I'll say. And ready-to-eat cereal is the #1 food consumed in American homes for breakfast, by the way. That's why the market's blown up.
Are you saying you are against all cereals? Like you want like Magic Spoons, like the ones that use like allulose, so the other ingredients?
No, I mean, I think
the fact that it's,
I'm getting asked questions by my producer.
just the fact that it's processed.
So the processing itself, remember I talked about the high heat, the different temperature changes, changing the moisture content of the food, taking off the hull, taking out the fiber. Processing a food effectively means you're deconstructing it into different little ingredients and then putting the ingredients back in a different way and adding things so that it can be transported across the world and sit on a shelf for a while and not grow bacteria, right? Think about this. If you make bread yourself at home, generally speaking, it's going to mold within 3 to 5 days. If you go buy bread at the store, it is not going to have mold on it for, I want to say, 2 months. Now think about that. That is scary, but that's because it's got the preservatives in it to make it shelf stable, therefore legal. It is not legal to sell homemade bread and put it on the shelf. You would have to throw it away after 2 days, probably after 1 day, honestly. So again, John Kellogg said the gut is the source of all ills. Food should be pre-digested and easy to assimilate. Highly processed breakfast cereal happened. So what do we do now? Now there's a whole movement I've been pushing. I'm a big fan of the Mediterranean diet, returning to minimally or unprocessed foods, trying to cook more at home, try to keep the fiber on the food, try to keep the protein, keep the micronutrients, don't burn them off with high heat processing and factory made foods. I think this is where we're going, hopefully. And I'm just going to keep doing talks and just keep teaching as long as I can to get us back there.
Well, I want to like revisit this.
We got more questions.
There are products now, they're adding back fiber, they're adding protein, and they're taking out the sugar, but it's still processed cereal.
Right. The comment is there are products now that have added fiber and added protein. True. Yes, the food industry is going to sell what the market wants. Currently, the market seems to be indicating they want healthier options. So they're going to make a highly processed, healthy option for us. My point is, I don't really believe it. And I think, yes, if you have to eat cereal, maybe pick one of those versus like something with a ton of added sugar. Sure. But really, it's better if you make your own food at home with whole actual foods that are like real foods, not factory deconstructed put back together like a Rubik's Cube and, oh, here's your food.
Also rethink what the American diet is, what the American society has said about what breakfast
Okay, next slide.
We're introducing.
All right.
Like actual what breakfast should be. It doesn't mean.
What should breakfast be? Yeah, then you have the whole question of, do you even really need breakfast? Another question. Remember, 3 meals a day was started because of the Industrial Revolution, and they didn't want people going home for lunch. So they made a short lunch break and fed them at work. That's a whole nother talk. Anyway, remember, this was sponsored by the Well Theory. I'm Dr. Warner. I'm going to be doing more of these if you like them. Let us know. I wanted to do one on high fructose corn syrup. I'm going to do one on the history of Cheetos and Pringles, and different little topics in the food industry, because I think the history is important. It wasn't all bad. This all started as really good intentions. It just kind of went bad. I think just because of human nature, honestly. You can read the book I wrote, Bone on Bone. It's all about how to heal orthopedic issues naturally and to make yourself feel better naturally with different methods in your life, to include diet, of course, and also supplements, but even things like time-restricted eating, sleep, exercise, putting it all together to make you as healthy and optimized as you can be. And hopefully avoid coming to people's offices, such as myself, and trying to get surgery, which half the time doesn't work anyway. So Bone on Bone's a book. The Well Theory is a supplement company. And then next subjects, like I said, I want to talk about Pringles and Cheetos, GMO foods, CAFOs, which are concentrated animal feeding lots, fisheries and farm fish. What are these additives they're putting in our foods? I don't even know. And a lot of them are grass. Remember, they don't really have to get proven. They can just kind of let the FDA know when they feel like it. What are the regulations today? Who are lobbies? Who's lobbying who? And then what is the food marketing practice right now? They actually have taken, in Mexico, you're not allowed to put kid characters on cereal boxes anymore. In Europe, you're not allowed to have red dye 40. They canceled all Subway bread in Europe because there was so much added sugar in the bread at the Subways that they banned the bread there. So there's a lot going on globally with the food regulation that we are not seeing that maybe we should see here in America.